Hi, I'm Joe Saunders with Miniature Landscape Hobbies. In last week's episode, we covered all about scale. We learned how there were different types and what some of the unique characteristics of each scale were. This week, we're going to build on this, and we're going to detail how we can use these facts to help us improve our painting skills. A solid understanding of scale is an essential ingredient for taking your painting skills from good to great. Miniature Landscape Hobbies is proudly supported by these sponsors. In last week's episode, we talked about ratio or fraction scale, wargaming scale, and heroic scale. We also discussed how details could be rendered as a caricature with exaggerated proportions to make qualities of a miniature more obvious. We also looked at true scale, where everything is kept proportional to its real-world analog. If you've not watched last week's episode, I suggest you do. I'll put a link up for it. Many of the concepts I cover in this video today will be rooted in the detail and terminology I've mentioned in last week's video. In this episode, I'll reveal some tips that can help you adapt your model painting techniques to your chosen scale. This will help you with your work, and it will make your work go from good to awesome. I'd like to take a quick moment to thank my Patreon supporters. Without their assistance, Miniature Landscape Hobbies would not be possible. If you would like to learn more about the benefits of becoming a Patreon supporter, please check the link in the video description. Highlighting is the process of creating the impression that light is reflecting off certain points on the model, including where it might not actually be, or to exaggerate the amount reflecting. Shading is the opposite, creating and possibly exaggerating the depths on the subject that are not reached by the light. Understanding this is critical to model painting. We've likely all painted a flat color model where we just block in the colors with no eye for shades or highlights, and then subsequently we've compared it with a properly painted model. There's just no comparison. This is because larger subjects in the real world collect more light than smaller ones. For instance, a tank has a lot more surface area to bounce light off of than a person, and this has an effect on our brains. The human brain is designed to detect patterns, and if the pattern doesn't suit, we dismiss the subject as just wrong. It's the job of highlights and shades to bring this back into balance, so we can subconsciously grasp the appropriate intended size of the subject. The actual methods to achieve this range from using zenithal techniques with contrast or speed paints, to dry brushing, to layer painting. This is covered in any number of my videos, but the real tip you need to understand is that the smaller the model is, the sharper and brighter the highlights need to be. At the same time, the smaller the model, the darker the shades need to be. This of course creates extreme contrast, which is exactly what you want. Compare the highlights on this 1/100 scale Commissar model to the 1/20th scale Ammonite. Obviously the Commissar is smaller, so you can see the depths are almost black and the edges are defined by the clear, bright highlights. The Ammonite still has lighter areas where the light strikes it from above and darker recesses, but notice that there are less defined areas of light and dark. Despite this, both appear to be in scale, and you can tell one is a hulking robot while the other is just a man, even though he's likely to be a merciless political officer. We discussed last week that in order to convey the motivation, intent, or emotions of a miniature subject, their details are often exaggerated to draw attention. What you need to understand here is that when you paint, you need to work with these exaggerated elements, sometimes called heroic or caricature details, in mind. To do this, I suggest that at the outset of the painting process, you take a careful look at what parts of the model are oversized or embellished. This will almost always be the model's face, hands, and often weapons, though it can vary by subject. These are the areas you should focus on, providing extra attention, as this is what the sculptor has designed to be the primary focus for the viewer. In a lot of respects, the model designer or sculptor has already made the hard decisions for you, indicating what you need to put the effort into. Go ahead and do an extra couple of layers on the exaggerated areas. Use a complementary color or do whatever you think it will take to increase the visual interest of that point on the miniature. There's another consideration here too. You can capitalize on exaggerated details to speed up your work. Remember that if the detail is not exaggerated, then it's not drawing the eye, or not likely to draw the eye. What this means is that you are safer to cut corners on these less essential parts of the model. My main suggestion for this is to use slap chop, zenithal, or whatever other speed painting techniques you want. But for the parts that are obviously exaggerated, you should fall back on high quality brush painting and spend most of your time on the elements that the viewer is obviously supposed to be focusing on. I find this makes a really good trade-off between quality and speed for my work. You may want to try it too. Texture is something wargamers tend not to think about, but it's a common topic of discussion for scale modelers. This is because just as highlights need to be exaggerated on smaller models, textures need to be emphasized on larger models. What exactly am I talking about? Well, the appearance of imperfections, dirt, rough ground, and grime is something that registers with our brains. Look at a patch of rust and try not to imagine what it feels like. Humans just tend to either consciously or unconsciously consider the tactile qualities of the objects in our surroundings. To increase visual interest and create a sense of realism, then, we must consider texture's role in working with different scales. Usually this translates into weathering effects, but not always. We must not get to thinking too literally here, though. The smaller the scale, the less important the texture element is, as finer details can be cluttered by added texture, destroying contrast. For this reason, when working on smaller scales, you don't actually need to build a texture on the surface, just imply it. On my 1/100 scale tanks, I do this with sponge chipping. Make a small random series of marks with a light color of paint by dabbing a partially dried sponge on the surface. After it's dry, put a dot of a darker color in the middle of each light mark. Boom! Instant depth, and this implies a rough pitted surface, even though the surface is actually just flat. Moving to larger scales, it's better to pick a product that adds actual volume to the texture. My son Mitchell is an expert at HO scale weathering. HO scale is 1:87 size. To do this, he uses pigment powders that actually stick to the subject after a varnish or binder is applied, and this adds gritty rust tones and earth tones to the surface. Of course, the powders are actually really fine, but they come out in scale and look appropriate. With really large scales, though, you need to actually account for adding more extreme texture. Here is my 1/20 scale ammonite again. 1:20 is a pretty large scale, large enough that a viewer will be expecting to see lots of texture at a glance. To help with this, I've fallen back on an old scale modeler trick. I take an old brush and some Tamiya modeling putty and I stipple it on in a way that looks like cast metal. When I paint over it, the texture blends into the surface, but remains there. Remember that the larger the model, the less extreme the highlights need to be, so the texture goes to work establishing visual interest with very little effort. Before I finish talking about texture, there's one more consideration. At larger scales, you're better off using multiple methods to create texture, while with smaller scales, only one or two are required. For instance, on Mitchell's train, he has essentially used pigment powders to promote the texture, and only pigment powders. It looks great and enhances the interest of the model. Any more work would mess up the definition of the locomotive. The ammonite, however, is big enough to take multiple texture elements. For this reason, I've gone all out with pigment powders, sponge chipping, and putty stippling. All of this is included to draw the eye and create the impression for the viewer that there are very real tactile attributes to the robot. So there you have it, my thoughts on the different types of scales and some tips for techniques you can use to enhance your painting according to each scale's qualities. Remember though, the topic of scale is vast. No pun intended. So what I've covered here is just the tip of the iceberg. If you have any ideas or techniques of your own that you would like to mention, go ahead and put them in the comments. I'll be back next week with a new episode. Keep your eyes peeled. That's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed making it. Please remember to subscribe, press the bell button so you get immediate notification on our videos, and until next time, remember to keep building life in miniature.